All right, hello everybody. So this is going to be a kind of a series of responses to a recent interview I watched between Coleman Hughes, whose show I really like. I don't watch every episode, but he's a pretty fair interview, I would say, almost all the time. He certainly tries to be, and David Hogg. So David Hogg is kind of like the antichrist of the gun control movement. He was a student at Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida when the mass shooting happened there in 2017, and was quickly catapulted into the spotlight as a result of it. He wasn't the only one. There were three other students who became extremely famous anti-gun advocates, him being one. I even produced one pro-gun advocate in the person of Kyle Kashuv, although he's been subsequently canceled for things he said as a 16-year-old. Now, I'll put a link in the description for the entire video. I definitely think it's worth watching if you haven't seen it. But there's just a couple parts of this. It's really frustrating when you watch this and you see stuff said that you know is wrong or doesn't make sense or is misleading. And I decided to do that. So like all credit to Coleman. And actually there's a lot of things that David said that I do agree with. Like not everything he said was completely wrong. There's obviously some nuance there. I'm sure he's going to Harvard because of his politics and not necessarily of his scholastic achievements, but he's not stupid. He's obviously got some intelligence there and he has some nuance in his opinions. But nevertheless, he is still wrong. And I think that Coleman, although trying to be very fair, is not very conversant in this topic and lets a lot of things slide. I don't think because he's trying to help David or he'll always argue with people when he wants to, I believe, but just there are certain parts where I think he got wrong. So we're gonna go through this bit by bit, not the whole thing, obviously it's way too long. I'll put a link for those who want to watch it, but let's just do this whole thing.
Yeah, so I think on the topic of the assault weapons aspect, I'm by no means specifically a firearms expert in terms of that. And, it's a common...
So first, right off the bat, I'll forgive anyone who's not an expert on something. There's so much information out there in the world that how can you possibly chide someone for not knowing? But, it's now been 4 years, 3.5, 4 years since this shooting, and since he very actively made the decision to become an advocate. There were lots of students in that school who none of us have ever heard of, who are not famous. He deliberately made a choice to use this. You could cynically say for his career, his fame. He certainly did get that. That may not have been the reason. It may have been, sincere activism. But he was live streaming during the shooting, or at least in the immediate aftermath at the school. He was looking for fame. And he's had now 3.5 or 4 years to become an expert, right? It's one thing to not be an expert at one point, but you can become at least more knowledgeable than you were before, and a lot more knowledgeable in that amount of time. And who knows how much he could have read or learned in those years. And the question becomes, why didn't he, if this is like his wheelhouse, right? He's not famous for protesting GMOs or domestic or foreign policy or the drug war, anything like that. He has made his claim to fame has been this topic, and why he would then not study it. And he's basically had years off now because of COVID. This is something that you could study in parallel with whatever he has to do in school. So this is kind of interesting. I don't know why he would do that. I guess that's not really a refutation of anything, but it's weird set of priorities. I think when you want to be an advocate, you want to really push policy, but you don't want to get into the nitty gritty of the details. But
that's used to talk about these things when to shut down the conversation about the assault weapons and stuff. What I will say is that I think perhaps as we're having that conversation, and people that are quite frankly more qualified than I am to be talking specifically on the legal dynamics of what is and is not an assault weapon, a good step that we could make is actually reducing high capacity magazine sizes and the accessibility to them, or even their legality.
So he's deferring to other experts, but I would just question, obviously a magazine ban for anything over 10. That wouldn't include shotguns. That wouldn't include most bolt-action rifles or any bolt-action rifles. It wouldn't include revolvers. And, most handguns do have 10 or 15. There was a limit of 10 rounds for many years in the United States. And crime was higher during that. And then that ban expired in 2004. And now you can get, I don't think there's really any limit, although practically speaking, for handgun stuff over 15 is pretty rare. You can get like extended like 20, 30 round clips. I don't know, and he even referenced 100 round magazines at some point. I don't know if any crimes are committed with such large magazines as that. If they are, they're extremely rare and account for only the tiniest percentage. The other thing is, the vast majority of the homicides that take place, the 11,000 or so, I think crime has gone up since COVID a little bit, so I'm not sure where the numbers are now, but they had steadily declined and kind of reached around the 11,000 number of gun homicides, gun deaths. I would be very curious if they know how many of those happen with magazines larger than 10, and I think the answer is probably not very many. And most of those homicides aren't mass shootings. Those aren't people who are going and reloading multiple times to gun down 12, 15, 20 people. These are single homicides. They're double homicides, in which case 10 bullets is fine. So this makes sense as an incrementalist approach, but if you're talking about policy, this really seems like it's targeting the most dramatic, most news getting, but also statistically least important, these high profile mass shootings. I don't know what it would do to everything else.
As the one of the biggest things is that the people in these instances of mass shootings that are using weapons like AR-15 have that lethality oftentimes, not just because of obviously the power of the weapon in the first place, but I would say just as much the high capacity magazines that they're using that have more than 10 rounds in them.
Again, he knows that, he alludes it there, but like the magazines don't make, the actual rounds more powerful. And again, singling out AR-15s just don't even register. If you look at the top 5 guns that are used in crime, it's not on there. They're 4 handguns and I think a shotgun, like a cheap shotgun, like a Mossberg or a Remington 800. Those are the most common things. Like these are the most high profile, these AR-15s, but they're the, statistically like the least common. They kill fewer people than knives by far. They kill fewer people than hands and feet and clubs. People getting beaten the crap out of by 2x4s or bats, or just hands and feet. Actually, those are small numbers, by the way, but they're even bigger than the numbers who are killed by semi-automatic rifles. Let alone the subset of that are killed by AR-15s. Let alone the subset of that are killed by AR-15s with more than 10 rounds. Which I think nowadays most AR-15s are going to have 20 or maybe even 30 round magazines. And
if we have smaller magazines, it can it takes more time for them to actually reload and allows more people to tackle them or someone to step in and help stop it.
Someone to help stop it or tackle them. Why are we resorting to tackling an assailant? Why not shoot them, right? It seems like with a mass shooter or a single criminal, it would make sense. It would be far better to shoot them than to try and tackle them, and resistance, if you're going to resist. And he, to his credit there, he's not saying you have a duty to be a victim. You got to be passive. You have to let the criminal do whatever he wants. Congratulations. There are definitely people who don't agree with that. But if you're going to do that, well, I think the most effective way, and I think Gary Kleck's research and so does John Lott's research, kind of shows that's the best thing you can do. It's not perfect. Resisting with a gun is not a panacea. It doesn't mean that nothing bad can happen. It doesn't mean that you're magical or that you are suddenly Rambo, but you're more Rambo with a gun than you are just trying to tackle somebody or use your penknife or throw your book or your desk at them. So it's interesting that he just seems to preclude from the possibility of resisting with a gun.
Happening in the first place, and B, it allows that conversation that I think should be had about why it's not an assault weapon to continue on. But in the meantime, we can take.
Why should we have that discussion? The only purpose of that discussion would be for regulatory reasons to try and ban or restrict them. To define what you can, whatever you define as an assault weapon is then a pretext for then banning or restricting that to some degree, right? By calling it that, then you're saying, well, it has no legitimate person. It's a quote unquote an assault weapon. It's not a defense weapon. It's not a hunting weapon. It's not a target shooting or recreational weapon. It's an assault weapon. And then the logic implies it shouldn't be. So the only reason to have that discussion, the only reason to kind of mince words on that is for the purpose of future or current restrictions and very likely bans, right? If something is just evil, it's just an assault weapon. No one ever talks about assault cars, even though they kill more people, or assault drinks because they kill even more people. But I think that's the only reason you would have that discussion.
A very immediate step to talk about,
especially because the guns that the only reason for restrictions, and I can say that with a high degree of certainty, because the guns that they're talking about, the ARs and the AKs and basically the semi-automatic black rifles, are such a tiny, tiny fraction of the actual gun deaths, right? They're just the smallest subset that you're going to be able to isolate pretty much, other than 50 cals that are a 0% of the statistics. So, why is it so important, or why is it important to have that distinction when even making it, it's just not a big part of the homicide. It's not a big part of the suicide. It's not a big part of the quote unquote gun deaths broadly defined. So the only reason really to focus on it is an incrementalist way to restrict them and ban them.
In those instances, how can we stop it from being such a high casualty rate? And I think the best first step for that is a high capacity magazine ban, limiting it to something like 10 rounds, which I think, most people, even if you're just talking about the common argument, like self-defense in your home.
Well, yeah, it is good to have guns for self-defense in your home, even though most people are pretty safe and aren't going to need them. It's nice to have that option, right? I've got a fire extinguisher, even though I don't think it's likely that my place is going to burn down. I've got food supply in case there's an emergency, even though there's not likely to be one. But this is something that happens throughout this conversation. Absolutely no discussion about potential tyranny, even though Hogg is clearly someone who hates the police, and the police are evil, and the police are racist, and blah, blah, blah. I should have saved clips of that, but he says it repeatedly. Okay, but so if you're going to go up against people who are heavily armed and there's groups of them, yeah, you maybe want 20 or 30 rounds and not just 10. But it's something that is just left completely ignored in this discussion, which is interesting.
I don't think you need 30 rounds for that, in my opinion.
He also isn't an expert, and I'm not an expert. Like I'm going to say, I'm not a firearms expert, right? I'm not an instructor or anything. I don't have a ton of experience with them, but neither is he. So, the people who have things that they don't like or they don't have experience with, it's easy for you to dismiss them. Who needs? You can see somebody in New York City be like, who needs 200 acres of land, right? Who needs 1,000 acres of land? That's ridiculous. Well, they've never been to Wyoming. You need 600 acres of land just to feed one cow, right? So just because you don't understand or isn't in your personal experience doesn't mean that it couldn't be there, especially if you haven't taken the time to really, quote unquote, educate yourself, which he hasn't. I mean, he's admitted that he hasn't.
I think that's kind of ridiculous. But on the topic of how a lot of these guns are legal, you're right, they are oftentimes. But I think we need to realize, too, that there are many places where there are, separate public health issues, such as smoking, where there have been black markets that have been set up in the past to avoid taxes or a number of other things. However, we still work towards regulating it, because although there are people that get out there and do things that are still illegal, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything on the legal side either.
Well, smoking, I should look at the numbers here, but I believe it kills something like 300,000 a year, something like that, with lung cancer alone. Maybe I'm getting but it's in the hundreds of thousands. And of course, there's other things other than lung cancer causes. So, we've just orders of magnitude, at least 1 or 2 over all gun deaths, even if you count suicides and accidents and homicides. But also, just because there's policy in one area doesn't mean that policy is good, or that then follows into other areas. I mean, you can't precedence. Practically, yes, I understand that it makes it easier, but logically, it's not actually an argument. Slavery was very well precedented. We'd always had slavery. We'd always hurt the Indians. The women could never vote, right? There's lots of things that have always been. So, in terms of the logistics, yes, totally understand. It's an easier sell then, but it's not really a good argument.
And I think that also speaks to the reason why we need basically prescriptions of policies for with nuance incorporated into them, and the way that we talk about gun violence in America by not just talking about how does somebody get a gun legally or illegally in the first place, but also how do we prevent someone from wanting to get a gun
Also, note his use of the term there, gun violence.
in the first place. Is where there are illegal guns is are called violence intervention programs that offer community counseling and therapists and a number of other community members at the hospital to help stop retaliation from that.
Because I have absolutely no problem with this per se. I don't know how the government would be able to do this, but the idea of like violence prevention, that's fine. There are a couple of points here that they didn't talk about, but I have nothing against this. But nothing about this precludes people owning guns or using them in self-defense either.
And in the areas where they've done that, mind you, that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with regulating guns more whatsoever. That is simply trying to change behaviors from people from shooting each other in the first place. And in the areas where they've implemented those things, they've had a pretty significant impact at reducing gun violence. There's a conversation as well that needs to be had about the incredibly high suicide rate across America that are 2/3 of gun deaths that are just often completely left out of the conversation.
So yes and no, because it's true. Gun control advocates usually don't. They'll use two terms: gun violence and gun deaths. And whenever you hear those terms, that's misleading, because when most people think of a gun death, they imagine a homicide, and in particular, they imagine a mass shooting homicide of a child. I mean, that's just. You hear 11,000 and you think that, there's 11,000 corpses on the playgrounds of like 8-year-olds who got shot in the head. But the truth is that something like 2/3 of the gun deaths are suicides, and the smallest fraction are accidents. And so the number of gun homicides, it's much smaller, right? So it's only 11,000, 10,000, 9,000. It's probably maybe gone up a little bit since COVID. And those numbers, while still big, I don't want to say that those are nothing or they don't mean anything. It's a significant number. They're not as significant as 30,000. And so they'll use gun deaths and gun violence and all the time. It's very, very rare when you listen to a gun control advocate that they say gun homicides or homicides. They use this much broader term. And it's a little bit of a bait and switch, because people in their minds are then imagining these are all homicides, and they're not. They're suicides. And suicides are, he talks about the need for nuance. Yeah, absolutely, because suicide is a different thing. It's ethically different, right? Like people, if somebody murders somebody else versus they should kill themselves, I don't think there's anyone out there who would say that they're the same. Now, that doesn't mean that the suicide isn't potentially very tragic, and it almost always is, and sometimes it's probably preventably tragic. But the data on here is that guns don't cause suicide. People who are suicidal, especially men, prefer using guns, but it doesn't actually affect the rate. So like Japan does not have hardly any civilian gun ownership rate, but its suicide rate is 2 or 3 times higher than the United States. People are killing themselves all the time, and there's lots of ways to kill yourselves other than guns. Guns just happen to be a readily available and pretty effective way, 99, 95%. But I think that nuance is really important here. I know 2 people. Well, I know one person who was killed by a gunshot. And I didn't know him well. He wasn't a friend or anything, but he went to my high school. He was on my brother's hockey team. He was a year younger than me. And again, I did not really know him, but young guy, healthy guy, and he got married young. He graduated high school, married his high school sweetheart, and they had this perfect idyllic life. And then he got brain cancer. And he fought it. He had medical care, all that. It wasn't the case that he didn't have treatment, but he did, and it didn't work. And after a while, after he fought it for a while, he gave up and he shot himself. He killed himself with a gun. That's a really, really tragic story. It's a really sad story. I don't see how restricting firearms would have in any way prevented that story. And I kind of resent, I do resent, and maybe he would too, I don't know. I didn't know him well enough to know how he felt about this issue. But that his death would then be used, lumped in with statistics to restrict other people. Yeah, and the same would also be true with a smaller number of people who die accidentally. Most of the people who are dying accidentally, again, it's very sad, but they're probably people who use guns a lot. Accidents have been going down. Guns have been getting safer. Safety consciousness has really erupted. And while 50, 60, 100 years ago, death by gun accidents was way more, it still happens, but you're talking about people who use them a lot. It would be like, we should ban motorcycles because look at all the people who die in motorcycle accidents. The people who die in motorcycle accidents, they love motorcycles and they're okay with the risk. And the people that they're most likely to harm are themselves. Motorcyclists, though, obviously could potentially harm somebody else. Gun owners could potentially harm somebody else. It's just very, very rare. It can happen, but it's very, very rare. So again, taking people who love guns and who are taking the risk that maybe the very low risk that maybe there's an accident, and then saying, well, their deaths lend credence to restrictions, I think is going too far. And the same with suicide. So yes, nuance, but the gun control debate is always lumping in suicides with homicides with accidents, and then making you think that there's 35,000 school shootings every year.
That needs a whole separate policy prescription. So there are so many different nuances in this conversation. Yeah, I think a lot of it, I personally think the best approach in my view is that we know in general countries that have less guns in society in general, whether it be the police or civilians themselves, tend to have less gun violence.
So if that's true, if there's a correlation really there, then there needs to be, you can say with that correlation, it's a perfect correlation, it's 1, it's totally, right? There's no correlation, it's a 0 or it's a 0.5 or whatever it is. And unfortunately, this proves extremely difficult to actually prove. Now, people love to cherry pick. They love to say, when they say countries, right, they say other countries, what they really mean is the UK and Australia and Sweden and Liechtenstein and like a very, very small group of countries. They exclude all countries that have restrictive gun laws and low gun ownership rates, but high rates of violence and gun violence. Now, there's another philosophical argument to be had there about, is the distinction between gun violence and just regular violence a meaningful one? With societies that have a lot of guns, then a higher proportion of the violence that they do have is gun violence. So in the United States, a majority of the homicides are gun homicides. And there are many countries where that's not the case. In the UK, the majority of homicides are not gun homicides. And it's a big difference. There's also, this is a very tricky problem because how countries count homicides are different. The UK, for instance, which is the one that we're compared to the most often, they fundamentally count this differently. Homicides in the UK are counted by when you get a conviction for a homicide, right? If they find a person on the street who's been stabbed 50 times and they're dead, and they never make an arrest, or they make an arrest and they're unable to get a conviction, then that's not a homicide. It's just not. They don't count it as a homicide. In the United States, unless they have a strong reason to think somebody was a suicide, it gets counted as a homicide whether or not there's ever an arrest or a conviction. And indeed, about half the murders don't even lead to an arrest, let alone a conviction. So, and similar type problems can be found basically with every country you compare. But let's just say hypothetically that you could overcome that, which it probably is possible through empirical research to drill down. I've read extensive articles just on the UK, and it seems like it is difficult just the way they count. They seem to have a very strong desire on the part of the law enforcement there to undercount homicides. I've also heard similar things about Japan, where you'll have like somebody will commit suicide, but it'll be like a murder suicide, and they'll kill their whole family, and then that just counts as 4 suicides when it really is 3 homicides and a suicide in all likelihood. And how common is that? I don't know. Is it enough to affect the statistics? I don't know. In the UK, I've read articles suggesting that it could be as high, the homicide rate could be literally double what they say, just because of the way they count it. But there's a broader philosophical point. I really don't care what percentage of the people who die are killed by guns. I really care about what's the percentage of people who are dying violently. If you have society A, where the homicide rate is 2 per 100,000, but 1.8 of those 2 are killed by guns, and then society B, where the homicide rate is 4 per 100,000, but only 0.1% of them are killed by guns. Which one's better? Well, obviously society A is better. It has half the homicide rate. It doesn't matter if you get killed by a gun or by a knife. And so I think overall homicide rates make a lot more sense philosophically. Their argument then, though, isn't quite as strong. But the other thing is the cherry picking here is just ridiculous. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But
surprisingly, in some countries, many police officers don't even carry guns in the first place, right? And I see, obviously, the conversation around what happened to any number of individuals, but especially in the case of Breonna Taylor and other people, a conversation needing to be had about state forms of gun violence.
Yeah. Wow. So like you said, he wasn't all bad. Like, yeah, the state kills a lot of people and it coerces a lot of people, and for every person they gun down, there's thousands of people that they rough up and use their guns as a threat, but don't actually end up killing them. So what are you going to do about that? Right? If only there was some way that we could, leverage power or force against them. Or we're not supposed to do that, right? We're just supposed to beg them to be nice, right? Just like you said, if a criminal, right? You talked about if there was a shooter, you'd want to tackle them and whatever, and then that just sounds like desperately ridiculous. I remember Sam Harris wrote a great article, one of his best articles, maybe 10 years ago, about the idea that like, oh, we're going to use if your advice is to throw the desk or the book at the assailant, that's just pathetically desperate. But at least he would advocate resistance then. But if they're a cop, which he takes obviously the woke approach to this, but that's still going a long way. Like the cops are dangerous. The cops are bad. The state is bad. State violence is really bad. So what are you going to do? Are you going to tackle them too? Or maybe you could use a 30-round magazine. Who knows?
On its own citizens, obviously. And in some ways, I feel like it's almost like an arms race where these SWAT teams end up militarizing and using civilian arms like the AR-15 or, take your pick. It doesn't have to be that,
So a great book on that, by the way, and I can see it there on my shelf, but I'm not going to pull it out, is The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Belko. I think he works at Cato or Reason. I think Cato. Excellent book. And you can read about it documents basically the militarization of the police. And it was not because of civilians getting more and more armed. That's not what started the arms race.
Any number of these weapons to justify why they need to be more militarized, why they need bigger guns, and vice versa. And it kind of is this back and forth between police departments, local law enforcement, and civilians. When in reality, I think we need to focus on how can we start to demilitarize our ridiculously militarized, at least society as a whole, where it's not just
okay. Well, when the police and the military give up their guns, we'll give up ours. Sounds fair, right? Or no, we have to be. But all his efforts are to demilitarize the citizenry first.
The civilians in the first place that don't necessarily have. Of course, I don't want anybody being endangered, in the first place.
Wait, so when you say demilitarized, what do you mean?
I mean, over time, how can we reduce the number of guns in society? At least that's my view. And we have to figure out a good way to go about it. And I'm not necessarily sure what that is. I'm just saying, in societies, in countries where there are less guns, there are less shootings. Both.
Right.
Yeah, there's a strong correlation with less guns having there be less gun deaths just because there are less gun suicides. Now, the actual suicide rates aren't lower. They still commit suicide at more or less the same rates. Whether or not they have guns, it's just they don't commit them with guns then. And so then the total gun deaths in society goes down. The homicide rates aren't any lower. The percentage of the homicides that happen from guns, though, are lower. So again, if you've got a 5 per 100,000 homicide rate, who cares if 4 of them are guns and or 2 of them are guns or 1 of them are guns? So these restrictions don't reduce the actual amount of suicide. They don't reduce the actual amount of homicide. It just maybe sometimes can cause a shift in the ratios of what is committing those. The only thing that will actually go down will be the accidental gun deaths, but then you're punishing the people who like them, who are taking the risk, right? Yes, if we ban swimming pools and motorcycles, then no one will die from those things, but then the people who use them and enjoy them will also be completely deprived.
So
Okay, yeah. So let's enlarge this. So here we've got civilian guns per country. So you can see this color coded. Obviously, the United States is first, and then Yemen is second. And if the idea that gun ownership rates cause violence were to be a really sound principle, then the United States, which by far has the most, should have, I mean, logically, it should have the highest homicide rate and the highest suicide rate. And it doesn't. It doesn't have the second highest or the third highest. It's not even in the top 10. Same with Yemen. And if you look at these other countries that have high per capita gun ownership rates, you'll notice we got one South America, Uruguay, but Canada, Finland, Thailand, Australia, actually a lot of Western Europe, France, Austria, Israel, right? So, okay, what's the correlation here? This is just a Wikipedia article if you guys want to look it up yourself. So we've got estimated firearms per capita. Looks like Falkland Islands is second. It's crazy. And yeah, Canada, Serbia, Montenegro, Iceland's 12, Finland, Cyprus, Uruguay, Canada, Austria, Liechtenstein, Norway, Malta, Switzerland, New Zealand, Sweden. Okay. So these must be the highest homicide countries, right? With the most violence, right? They have the highest by far. I mean, the United States totally is a total. We got France, French Guiana, Germany. It's funny, Germany and Iraq are right next to each other. So we got a good mix, first and second world countries. Okay, so now this is firearms related deaths. So this includes suicides. All right, so so United States is not first, El Salvador is first. And El Salvador wasn't even on the, anywhere in that top 20 or whatever. We got Jamaica, same thing. Eswatini, I don't even know where that is. Nope. Honduras. Nope. Venezuela, Brazil. Wait a second. Colombia, Mexico, South Africa, Philippines. Okay. So Uruguay in America, the United States, they do make it on the list. So this is total gun deaths, per capita. So the suicides, all that stuff. But this is the most guns per capita. And what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, like 20, 18, 19, 20. So again, I don't want to misconstrue and say, well, look, this is I'm doing a precise correlation here. It's not, but there doesn't seem to be a rough correlation here. We've got Russia, Bolivia, Israel, right? Okay, let's continue. So this is just total deaths. But again, this is factoring things like suicide. So the countries with a high amount of gun ownership are going to have high relative gun deaths for that reason. Yeah, so I think I set this up to show by homicide in a second here. Boop, boop, boop. It doesn't look like I knew what I was going to do. No. Oh, that's no good. So that's fire alarm. Okay. Intentional homicide rate. So yeah, these are the overall homicide. Yeah, actually, let's go back a little bit here. I scrolled right past that, but you can see now these are the highest homicide rates. El Salvador, U.S. Virgin Islands, Jamaica, Lesotho, Honduras, Belize, Venezuela, St. Vincent, South Africa, St. Kitts, Bahamas, Trinidad, Mexico, and Antigua, Brazil, Dominica, Colombia, Guatemala, St. Lucia, Puerto Rico, Montserrat, Central African Republic. So, a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere, they're almost all very high. And then some sub-Saharan African countries, too, are making the list. Okay. So where's the United States? It's the most guns, so it should be, not, well, there we go. It's the 38. Gambia, Chad. All right. I mean, it's the number one most guns. It should have the most homicide, right? It's got to have the most homicide, right? I mean, all right, now oh, there it is, 94. Okay, so there's about 200 countries, so right in the middle, absolutely almost completely average. Okay, yeah. Super high correlation there. Yeah.
No, I think the reality is behind it that it's security theater. There was a police officer at my school.
Oh, there we go. Back. So, all that's to show that the correlation argument, I mean, it's just taken for granted. And I'll say one thing that annoyed me with Coleman is that he did not, he just accepted that. And again, yeah, there's some correlation with overall percentage, number of gun deaths, but that's factoring in suicides. You take out suicides, it doesn't really hold as much. And then overall violence, it doesn't really hold as much. So, it's just like the big problem is the proportion of the death that is because of guns. And even if you have a lower death rate, if the percentage of that is more guns than other places, then that's really bad. And I just don't philosophically see how that makes any sense at all, right? Who cares? Yes, suicide's an issue, suicide's a problem, but the fact that guns aren't driving the suicide rate, and again, suicide's not the same as homicide. And so you have lots of countries that have very, very high homicide rates that, have low gun ownership rates and have lots of restrictions. In North America, the only two countries that have, there's three: Uruguay, United States, and Canada. And the United States and Canada have like the lowest crime of all the countries in the Western Hemisphere. So why isn't, and the other thing, well, we like to compare ourselves to like Mexico or to Sweden, and shouldn't we compare ourselves to Mexico? I feel like we have more in common with Mexico than we do with Sweden. And so this cherry picking happens where we're like, well, we're only going to pick these couple countries. They're really small, all white countries. And those are the ones we're going to compare to. And even there, it doesn't really work. So a lot of those countries like Germany, France, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, all have really high gun ownership rates. So now this part is interesting too. So I'll give major credit for David here, because Coleman brings up the idea of having resource officers, police officers in the schools to protect people. And to his credit, and I was surprised by this, David is very much against that idea. Let's see.
No, I think the reality is behind it that it's security theater. There was a police officer at my school, and all the years since we have hired thousands of school resource officers, there's not a single instance where they've actually stopped a school shooting from happening, where they actually intervened. So
why is that? Because of cowardice? Or
probably, I can't tell you the exact reasons. I don't know the motivations of these individuals. I think the person at my school it was probably cowardice, fear, you name it. But I think that a lot of that's security theater. And I think if we look at the instances of actual school violence between these school resource officers and students, not even talking about how often they have, they could possibly kidnap students, they could sexually assault them, molest them, or etc. Because not all these people are necessarily.
Yeah, so he's absolutely right about this. So awesome. Didn't expect that, but there it is. And it speaks to his realism that he can see that and say it with some passion. They argue about this quite a lot in the video, actually. But I think that what would be important to understand is that the idea that the police are there to protect you is itself security theater, not just in the school, not just school resources officers. The idea that if you're getting victimized by a crime, you alert the police and then they rush in and protect you is literally fiction. That's CSI, that's every movie. And it's in the media, it's in so many movies, the protagonist is some kind of law enforcement officer, or they work with law enforcement officers, and they are always interceding at the last second. And that is exceptionally rare. It's also not their purview. It's not in their wheelhouse. It says right in their bylaws and in the Constitution that they have no duty to protect anyone. I mean, it's been litigated many times. I should pull up the Supreme Court case, but you can look it up yourself. People have done it where they call the police and the police fail to protect them, and then they sue or whatever, and the Supreme Court says no. So like, and that's the reality. And it's great that he doesn't have rose-colored glasses when he comes to these officers, these security officers in the school. I think he might exaggerate their abuses, but they are there, and they have killed people. Like there are cases. I remember one where Reason did an article on a guy who was allegedly had shared nudes with his girlfriend. Don't know if he actually did or not. And the resource officer threatened him with, that's child porn. You're going to go to prison. And the guy went and killed himself immediately. Not with a gun, by the way. He jumped off of a high building. So, yeah, the thing is, the police aren't. I mean, we can harp on the police, and that's fine. I don't mind doing that. I think that it's philosophically difficult to find a good cop just because of all the corruption and abuse that happens, that even the ones who don't participate in it directly don't do anything to stop. So that makes them culpable to some extent. But just practically speaking, it's kind of impossible for them to really be that, right? And again, the evidence here that they really deter crime is pretty low, because where's the most crime? The most crime is in big urban centers where there's readily available police, right? These areas where we're getting lots of murders in Chicago, they're obviously never more than a couple blocks, certainly less than a mile from a cop or even a police station, and yet it happens all the time right under their nose. But then you go on to these rural areas where, like, you can call 911, even if they start right on the way, they're an hour away. It's plenty of time for a crime, and yet crime is very low. Right? Now, I'm not attributing causation there. I'm just saying that there doesn't really seem to be a correlation. And I think that the reasoning that he's using here for schools, I think maybe he should use for the rest of society. They can't protect you, and they won't. They don't. They don't have to. And then that begs the question, well, if they can't, well, who should? Well, yeah, you should do it yourself. And the best way to do that is with a gun.
The good people in the first place. Putting all of that aside, because that stuff has happened, and it does happen, it also endangers students themselves. Should the best solution really be when I'm talking to a student about their, how they're talking to me about their mental health issues, as I've had many conversations about, and students come out defense aspect. Personally, one of the reasons why I would never own a gun in the first place is because if we look at the actual, if we go not with the concept of how Americans like to view guns, and that everyone thinks they may be a vigilante or some kind.
Right, but we can go with the myth about the police protecting you. Right, he even recognizes that as a myth and security theater when it comes to schools. But that's absolutely true with the society in general. In fact, it's even a school resource officer. If anything, it should be easier, right? They're right there. They're in the same building or on the same facility, which is going to be closer than the cops typically, and yet they completely fail. Yeah, the myth, we should not have the myth that the police are going to protect us. I absolutely agree.
Kind of version of Superman or something, and that they can just immediately have perfect aim with a firearm that they often have very little.
You don't have to have perfect aim.
Training with it all, and even if they do, they're still, not required to practice it that much at all. Oftentimes, the person that you endanger most by having a gun in your house, if you actually look at the statistics on it, is yourself or somebody else in your household.
Yeah, well, if they're suicidal, yeah. But the chances that you accidentally shoot them is minuscule, and the chances that you murder each other pretty low. And well, we'll get there.
Also, to have guns, have a 5 times higher chance of somebody in the house, even if they're not the gun owner, killing themselves if they have a gun in the household, because the success rate of gun suicide is unfortunately so high.
Okay, so we're going to ban guns because some people kill themselves with them, right? I mean, just doesn't. That's a huge thing. And we're now like, we switched from a school shooting, which is why this guy's famous and how he got into the public spotlight, to now, well, suicide. And not to say that suicide isn't tragic, but it's completely different philosophically. And to take away other people's rights because some people kill themselves, that just doesn't necessarily follow. Like there's a big bridge that he's just kind of leaping.
On top of that, I cannot tell you the plethora of instances that I've heard of individuals that have a gun turned on them.
Oh shit! And that would be better than them just not having one in the first place. Oh no! Now I don't have a gun. My gun was turned on me. Now I don't have a gun. Oh shit! But he would just say you should always not have a gun anyway. So okay.
Or B, have their home invaded because people know that there are guns in there, so they can go and sell them on the black market, which is enabled by the gun lobby that makes it harder to make sure that we're able to actually track
Right. If there was no NRA, there wouldn't be a black market in guns. Got it.
down these guns in the first place, through the different systems that have been created.
Right. There's no way that, by the way, the government registering guns or keeping track of where they are, or how about this? Newspapers publishing the lists of people who have concealed carry permits, something that has happened, that doesn't contribute to that, right? That's actually happened where, like, because some states require you to register to concealed carry and the state has those lists and they're publicly available, newspapers will then publish them. Is he mad about that? Nope. And he probably does know about that. I mean, he strikes me as smart enough that he probably does know about that. But that's not what he's thinking. He's talking about the NRA running interference for black market gun dealers. Yeah.
Purposely corrupted to make it hard, which enables that black market to even be more existent and prevalent. Not to say it wouldn't be there if we had the perfect system.
The regulations make it a black market, right? If we just get rid of the regulations, there won't be a black market. That's why we don't prohibit liquor and alcohol, even though they're demonstrably worse than guns. They kill way more people and harm hugely more than they kill, but we don't have a black market that much. I mean, there's a little bit of a moonshine one, but not much of a black market in liquor, and that's a good thing. Right? It's a good thing we ended prohibition.
In the place, it likely still would be. It just wouldn't be at the same level. So all of those things combined, I think, people are going to own guns, and so be it if that's what they choose to do.
Again, like I said, I have all those same reservations about myself owning a gun. I think if I did do it, I would be on the most responsible end of the gun ownership spectrum because of my personality. And I do think it's possible to judge yourself at the competent end of the spectrum. At the same time, just having a gun in your home is something that far more people take way too lightly, right? Like probably the typical gun owner takes it far more lightly than they should, and that itself.
I don't know how he knows that. Like, based on what? I didn't grow up with guns. I grew up with archery. My dad's a bow hunter, so I grew up with bows and arrows. Never touched a gun until I was like 23 or 24. And the first time I owned one was a little bit after that. I think I was 23 when I bought my first gun. And the first time I touched it, I was like, oh my God, this is like, it's scary. Now, after it sits in the closet, locked away for months and years, it loses some of that allure. But, the idea that you get one and it just makes you want to commit suicide or become a mass killer is just silly. I mean, way too many own them and don't do that for that to be true.
It's a major problem. But I want to return to this point about having a security officer in the school. It's like as the rule of thumb for the policy, right? It's like you could do the same on the other side of the argument and say, well, there are a couple hundred examples every year of good gun owners, saving the day. That does sometimes happen. It's rare, but it happens a couple hundred times a year where someone has a gun in public and is able to stop the bad guy and save a life. But those things are so rare that they shouldn't be the main consideration.
Well, here's the other thing.
Okay. So, agree and disagree. He's talking about defensive gun uses, and we look at this number of justifiable homicides by law enforcement officers and private citizens in the United States. So you look at these numbers, and they're actually pretty. Law enforcement officers tend to kill more people than private citizens. It looks like the only year that wasn't the case was 2019. But they're kind of similar, and so we're looking around 400 killed by police justifiably, and let's put a big question mark on that. I mean, the standards that they have to live by, they get judged by completely different standards. They get away with so much, it's ridiculous and it's criminal. So actually, it would not surprise me if this law enforcement number was half that. Wouldn't surprise me at all. On the other hand, private citizens, and this does vary somewhat where you live, get judged much, much more harshly. Right, you really, really have to show. I mean, George Zimmerman got put on trial for this and almost got convicted, even though that was a very clear case of self-defense. So these, you can take these dark bars is absolute minimum. These are after government scrutiny, government attempts to, catch these people. And you look, 300, 400. Granted, given the population of the United States, we're talking about 1 in a million-ish. On the other hand, these numbers are larger than the numbers of, say, mass shooting victims. The other thing to remember, though, the thing that Coleman is ignoring here, and it's kind of sad, is that this is only if you kill the assailant. Let's see. Yeah, this is only if you kill the assailant. And the thing is, almost all defensive gun uses don't involve killing your assailant. All right, this is one of the big problems with the so-called Kellerman study. Because Kellerman said, well, you're more likely to be killed by a gun than to use a gun in self-defense. Now, people actually read it wrong and thought you were more likely to be killed by your gun than to kill an assailant. And yes, for suicides, that is actually true. But if you're talking about homicidally, no. In fact, in his study, they didn't even specify whose gun was used. So if you had a gun and then you got killed by a burglar who had his own gun, then that counted. But the thing is, that's like saying, well, the odds that you're much more likely to be killed by your own gun than you are to shoot the assailant in the right temple. Wait, what's the problem with that? Well, because what if you shoot him on the left temple or in the forehead or in the chest, right? So defensive gun uses, the vast majority of them don't involve, the vast majority of them don't involve the gun even being fired. The most common thing when people use a gun defensively is to brandish it, to show the gun, and that will almost always dissuade the criminal and the encounter. Almost always. No one's hurt, no one's killed. Then you have this whole category where the gun is fired and either deliberately misses or just misses anyway, still ends the encounter, and then you have the cases where the assailant is hit but not killed, where they're wounded. That's way more common than when they get killed. So that 300, ish, 1 in a million becomes 1 in 1,000, something like that. Let's continue with this. Yeah, so there's lots of research on here. We've got Kleck and Gertz. The estimates on how many times people use guns defensively in the United States, it's not 400 or 300. It's in the hundreds of thousands or millions. And you don't have to listen to Gary Kleck. The CDC did a survey in the early 90s and came up with the number 2.5 million per year. And then they buried the study because they didn't like the result. So when Coleman says, well, it's super rare to use, well, yeah, it's super rare to justifiably kill someone. I'm about to say murder, but it's very rare to justifiably kill someone. It's not so rare to use it in self-defense where you don't kill them, right? If you brandish. So that's a huge omission. I tend to think that Coleman is intellectually honest and maybe just didn't know that, but that's really important. And for all the people out there who worry about the welfare of the criminal, well, them getting scared away and not getting shot or killed is good, right? You're about to be victimized. You pull out your gun, they run away. There's very few crimes where that's not the case. They're just gonna still attack you anyway. This is one of the most common tricks. I think it goes back to the Kellerman study. Well, you're way more likely, the odds that you kill an assailant are just so, yeah, they are. You don't need to kill them almost ever, right? You rack that shotgun that says unwelcome, they're going to leave, right? And then you can find all kinds of videos of people pulling out guns, shooting in the air. I was watching an active self-defense video. It was in another country. It wasn't in the United States, but it looked like some guys were looking like they were about to kidnap somebody, like a girl, but she was with her uncle, and he kind of caught wind of it, and he just kind of pulls out a handgun and kind of stands there and let them see it, and they just buzz away, So here, I'm scrolling through some of the studies. So Reason did an article about the CDC study. It was just discovered relatively recently, and then Gary Kleck wrote a follow-up article about it based on trying to, re-estimate. And there were questions about the estimates. People use... But even the lowest estimates, people like to use the
way that they may be endangering students. But the reality is, if we want to go with the total holistic view as you're talking about, and not just talk about these
So finish this point, David. Sorry to interrupt you, David. The numbers are huge, right? The CLEC and CDC were coming up with millions. That was in the early 90s when there was higher crime. So these are presumably lower now, but so what? They're a million, they're 700,000, they're 500,000. People will, there was a national crime survey that was done also, and big survey, right? Really good survey. And that came up with much lower numbers of like 70 to 100,000. The problem is that survey wasn't about defensive gun uses. Right. That survey was about crime. And in the course of that survey, they would ask people, were you a victim of crime in the last whatever year, 5 years, whatever the time scale was. And they would say, if they said yes, they said, did you do anything, as a result? And they could say yes or no. And that was it. Some people said yes, some people said no. Now, resisting could have meant you ran away, could have meant you called the cops, could have meant you physically resisted, could have meant anything. And they didn't ask. Some people then added, unprompted, I used a gun. And then they used those numbers, but they didn't ask them if they used a gun. They didn't ask them what they did. They just said, did you resist at all? And then they would say yes or no. And then they'd say, oh, there we go. That's, again, that's like saying, 0.01% of the population goes on vacations to Florida. How do you know that? Like, well, we asked people, do you ever go on vacation? And 50% of people said yes, 50% said no. And then we didn't ask any other questions, but some of the people who said yes just on their own said, well, we go to Florida. And you're like, yeah. Well, no, you didn't even ask. So that's a terrible number. But all that's to say, that number is still 100,000, not 300 people, not 400 people, not 1,000 people, 100,000 people. And that's, the worst estimate. To their credit, they weren't trying to even do that study. It's just an affect that came up with their research, but they weren't even specifically looking for that. But even that number completely throws out the cost benefit analysis that Coleman is invoking here. But the true number is probably 10 times higher than even that.
Statistical outliers. There are no statistical outliers when it comes to actually stopping school shootings in the first place, despite tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of school resource officers being, brought into schools. And the reality is, many schools around the world do not have police officers and they don't have school shootings. And it's not because they have school resource officers in their schools. It's because they have a society that values human life over, quite frankly, ridiculously easy act.
Right, but only the human life, right? You don't value human life if they're killed by knives. Like, that doesn't factor in at all. You're not talking about overall violence rates. You're talking about specifically the proportion of them that are gun violence. The only lives that matter are the ones that are lost to guns. All the other lives, fuck them.
Access to weapons in the first place. So that's what I mean that's the main point that I'm getting at, is these resources are being misspent because we have a society that loves to use essentially the police as a hammer for every policy issue, even if that's not the best thing to do.
Totally agree. I was impressed by a lot of what he said, to be honest.
And I personally believe that those resources would be spent better in other places.
Yeah, absolutely. They would be spent way better if they were never taxed, and the people who made the money, who earned the money, and have their own lives to live and their own concerns and their own things that they need the money for, if they had that money to then dispose of as they saw fit instead of how the politicians saw fit. Yes, absolutely, 100% agree. I'm sure that's exactly what he meant.
Yeah, I get that. I think
Coleman really likes the idea of resource officers. I don't know why. David has, the best arguments he makes in the whole thing are against them. He makes very cogent, very good arguments against school resource officers. And Coleman is just, he's looking unreasonable relative to David Hogg, which is crazy, but there it is.
Here's what I worry about. When you say we have a society that, obviously America has a crazy gun culture society. We have a level of violence in our society that puts us completely out of step with all of the nations.
Which, by the way, is true and also predates any differences in the gun laws. All right, so the United States has always been more violent than Western Europe, as long as there's been a United States. From colonial times to pre-colonial times, always. And this is another huge problem with this correlation issue that people bring up. If you have two places, the United States and the UK, and let's say the United States has 4-5 times the homicide rate right now. Like, well, look, it's because It's because the United States has all these guns and the UK doesn't. Well, but if you go back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 350 years, the United States consistently has that same, like, so New York and London, it's always been about 5 times. It's recently caught up because New York has come down. But for like 300 years, New York had 5 times the homicide of London. And for the whole country, it's not as dramatic as that, but it's still like double. And so if you have the ratios of violence were the same prior to the gun control that the UK implemented progressively over the course of the 20th century, then it's a pretty good indicator that that's not the reason. It's actually an excellent indicator that the gun control is not the reason for the difference, because the difference precedes, right? The best example here is Australia, right? Australia has very low, gun homicide, very few mass shootings, but their rate started to drop in 1988, and their gun restrictions came in 1997. So wait, how can that be? Like the something made them go down 10 years before the ban. So that something wasn't the ban. I mean, there's just no time travel here. The other thing too is the UK has only ever had now, I would always say 3 mass shootings. They just had their 4th a few weeks ago in Plymouth. So they had 2 mass shootings before their gun control and 2 mass shootings after. Now, let's be fair, 2 is very low, but it was very low before they had restrictions, right? If Iceland banned all guns tomorrow, and Iceland has the lowest homicide rate, or basically the lowest homicide rate, people, well, it's because of their gun control. Look, obviously, there's something about that society that's very nonviolent, and there's something about the United States that is very violent, relatively speaking, to the other quote-unquote first world countries, not relative to the rest of Latin America. If you look at the rest of the Western Hemisphere, Canada and the United States are by far the least violent. But if you look at the rest, I mean, we're in a rough neighborhood in terms of that violence. And it makes it like the histories there of the Americas are different from the histories of the old world. Nuance, right? No. There's no nuance. The only factor that matters is guns. Unless we're talking about a Latin American country, then obviously it's poverty and all this other stuff, or colonialism, but it's not guns then, because they don't have them.
Typically compare ourselves to in the world. And that has something to do with the culture.
That's true.
No doubt. So here's what I worry about. I don't know how to remake society from whole cloth into a society with a different set of norms. It's possible. It seems very difficult, and it seems like a faraway goal. What might put me more at ease is to create a training program for people, a high prestige job, almost.
He's about to say one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard Coleman Hughes ever say. And Coleman Hughes, again, I respect him. He's very smart. He's very fair. But this is just kind of bonkers what he says here. I think this is more bonkers than anything David Hogg has said.
Akin to the military, where your only job is, if there's a mass shooting at the school, you are expected to sacrifice your life to defend it. Right? Like, that seems also hard, but not as hard as remaking all of society. So given that it seems like a really tough issue to actually solve, we're going to have guns in this country forever. Is that not the more realistic or practical path to walk down, even if we haven't come close to perfecting it yet?
No, because I think if we measure the total number of lives that are going to be basically destroyed by further incarcerating children because of school resource officers being often used as a hammer on kids at times, and granted, there are exceptions to this. There are students that are violent, like the shooter at my high school, that need to have, not be in school in the first place. That is an exception that I'm willing to make, that obviously needs to be addressed. And that's specifically what I'm talking about in that regard, is that the number of total students, especially students of color that have worked extensively with me and, in the gun violence prevention space specifically, that advocate on this issue. And after talking to them and working in schools, where, there are school resource officers, the way that I personally see it is that the total number of lives that end up being frankly destroyed by being incarcerated for something, or being put down a path for something that frankly could have been handled in a number of different ways, and also the number of students that end up getting severely assaulted or even killed by these school resource officers far outnumbers how, the reality, which is that they haven't stopped a single school shooting. So why have them in the first place? We've had 20 years since Columbine, with school resource officers being extremely prevalent throughout American society. Not once have they stopped a school shooting. I don't see that fear of that possibility of them ever stopping one, even though they haven't in 20 years, and we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on these school resource officers as being worth more than preventing students from being incarcerated, students and administrators specifically using them as a hammer on students, and the risk that they pose to the students in the first place, because that is the reality of the past 20 years. It's the legacy of incarceration that they've left behind. And you may not agree with that, and that's fine, but that's just my view.
Do training people specifically for the purpose of preventing mass shootings and not to, or like, in many cases, we have to be able to imagine how a thing could get better, whether that is gun control policy, the culture, and it seems like you're capable of imagining these things getting better, but not capable of imagining a scenario where security guards get much better, right? It's like we've got to improve some aspect of this, and it seems like it just seems to me the more realistic and practical one is to try to improve. And I take all of your points about how security guards have abused their power in schools, no doubt. But like we have to be able to imagine some of this getting better. And it seems if the alternative is, to just figure out, and the truth is none of these things are mutually exclusive, right? Necessarily. We can parallel path it, and we have to reduce this issue. But are we permanently in a scenario where at the very end of the day, if someone comes into a school with a gun, the quickest thing that can be done is to call the police and hope they come in time? Is that the limit of our ability practically to solve the issue, and to hope that all of the early childhood work we're doing is reducing the number of these people to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you really wanted to focus on something that, and maybe my opinion changes on this, and I try to see these things from all sides and be willing to change my opinion when confronted with like new information. But from my view, I don't think it necessarily doesn't mean there isn't anyone that isn't, able, theoretically, for the security theater and comfortability of people to stop these things in these instances, assuming they actually would, which they haven't in the past 20 years at all. Especially in the case of my high school where that person was on campus and had been there for years. If you want to have someone there whose specific job is to do that, sure, let's do that. But I don't want them to be armed in the first place, and I don't want to see videos of them going in and throwing students on the ground and beating the crap out of them and abusing their power and hiding behind the police unions and never being held accountable. Because as an example of that, despite the fact the SRO at my school did not stop the shooter at all, because of the power of the union, the policing union, and a number of other factors, and him saying that it was not part of his responsibility whatsoever to stop the shooting, and I think a judge upholding that.
Wow.
He got to get his job back, right? I don't think that's okay.
I didn't know that either. I think that what he's alluding there, why that's so powerful though, and especially if you're a libertarian, is he's bumped into, without realizing it, a basic incentive problem with the state, right? They don't hold themselves accountable. This is why Coleman's earlier suggestion that you have these people who are highly trained, highly motivated, suicidally going to stop a shooter makes no sense, because the whole point of the state is to be parasitic and to control and to give yourself status and wealth, but especially status within society. And you don't do that by being a sacrificial lamb, right? They're the rulers. They're not the ones who are going to sacrifice themselves for us, or for anyone, as we have the case there. They have every incentive not to do that. They have the unions, they have the courts, they have the legislatures, all of them on their sides to A, abuse power, right, and B, to not do anything. The things that they're ostensibly supposed to do, the things they supposedly exist, they don't have to do anything, right? They'll always have their paycheck, and they'll always have their prestige, and they'll always have their badge. And the same resource officer who hides behind his badge and doesn't do anything and doesn't stop a mass shooting in the school is the same cop on the street. It's exactly the same, only even less likely, I would say. So one thing that they never discussed, two things. Well, what about letting teachers have concealed weapons? What about students who are old enough, who pass qualifications to carry concealed weapons? Or even better yet, why do we even have public schools? Like, the whole problem with these mass shooter scenarios, and again, it's a super rare problem. It's not something, it's so, letting that drive the conversation is sensational, and it's not going to lead to good policy, right? It's like, we should have policy that's completely driven by leprosy. No, it doesn't make sense to do. Well, leprosy is terrible. Yes, leprosy is terrible, but right? But if you have a policy that's just addressing that one thing, you can screw everything up. But the point here is, if you have an area where guns are banned and there's a lot of people, so it wouldn't matter if you had like some secluded forest in the middle of Alaska and they did a gun ban there, so no one's allowed to have a gun in that forest. It wouldn't really be a problem because there's nobody there. But if you have a place where there's a high concentration of people and you say guns are not allowed to be there, then, well, anyone who wants to kill a lot of people knows that that's where they go. People want to kill a lot of people. They don't go to a gun show, even though there's a ton of people there. It's a big crowded room. They don't go to places where there are a lot of people where concealed carry is allowed. These mass shootings are concentrated in the peppering. If you look across the United States, concealed carry is legal in almost every state and widespread in almost every state, with a few exceptions. And most of the mass shootings are happening in places like schools or churches, things like that. They're not happening with the general public. So you don't want what's so-called victim disarmament zones, because they're magnets for this type of crime. And also, you don't want to put people in the position where they can't defend themselves. Like, he wants you to tackle someone, and Coleman wants you to have someone there to defend you, right? They want to have this bureaucrat who has no incentive and no legal duty to protect you. They want that, but they don't ever consider, neither one of them, the idea that maybe you can defend yourself with something more than a double leg takedown. Okay? So yeah, get rid of the victim disarmament zones, which means either legalize guns in them or just fucking abolish public schools anyway, which would be, honestly, the best solution to this problem.
Right? My school did not stop the shooter at all, because of the power of the union, the policing union, and a number of other factors, and him saying that it was not part of his responsibility whatsoever to stop the shooting, and I think a judge upholding that.
Wow.
He got to get his job back, right? I don't think that's okay, right? That level of basically total lack of any accountability, and the fact that he got to continue in that position despite all of that is ridiculous. But
he's the government. George W. Bush taxed everyone, forever, took all of our money for defense, for military, and the one day in 70 years that the military needed to defend this country, they completely failed. Completely 100% failed. The only people who did anything on September 11th were the people on Flight 93 who took down the hijackers themselves. The entire military-industrial complex, the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the Coast Guard, the New York City Police Union, the state police, none of them did a damn thing. They completely failed, and they had zero consequences. They became more popular, and they took more power. And what he's describing is just a microcosm of that on the practical street level. And I will credit him for seeing that. I will 100% credit him for seeing that. Now he just needs to open his eyes and see that's not just true at Douglas Stoneman High School. That's not just true with the resource officers at whatever other school. That's true with every police officer on every street, in every state, in every city, in every year of this entire fucking country.
Moving on, besides that point, I think the amount of resources, given the fact that despite 20 years of school, thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, if not more, the school resource officers being in schools hasn't stopped a single school shooting. If we still want to have something like that, and we've seen the reality of students being beaten, their lives being possibly even endangered in some cases, and also being incarcerated, if we want to have somebody there to actually have, the possibility, whose sole responsibility is to stop a school shooting from happening, that is unarmed but is trained on how.
They have no accountability. So he knows that. I will give it again. Coleman seems to have trouble with this, but David seems to understand it pretty well. They have no accountability, and they never will.
To de-escalate the situation and prevent that person from doing that, or tackle them, or whatever it may be, and they're expected to sacrifice.
Tackle them, but not shoot them.
It's their life, and so be it. But I don't want that person having a gun in the first place, and I certainly don't want to see them, having the ability necessarily to go and arrest students for minor infractions that need a detention, right?
Sorry, guys. I don't know. I don't know what all that was.
That's the way that I see it, at least personally. And there are a number of. That's the way that I see it. And destroying any possibility they have at coming back from that mistake in life. That's the way that I see it, at least personally. And there are a number of. At coming back from that mistake in life. That's the way.
There we go. I don't know what that was about.
Right? Or it can be handled in a multitude of different ways that do not end up getting on their actual record and destroying any possibility they have at coming back from that mistake in life. That's the way that I see it, at least personally. And there are a number of serious policy issues that would need to be confronted within that specifically, because there are a number of ways where it completely falls off the rails that I can see. But if we wanted to live in a society where we did that, where we did advocate, some money towards, preventing school shootings in terms of someone like that being there in the first place, I could be open to that. But I do believe that there's for the impact that they're having, which is literally zero in the past 20 years of actually stopping these things from happening, or practically zero, right? For that impact, it's ridiculous that we're spending that much money when we could invest it in other places and diversify the number of solutions that we have at A, stopping students from getting to that place, B, preventing them, God forbid, should anything ever happen in the first place.
Yeah. So my final topic I want to discuss, and this is another one that there's a lot of interest in, obviously, is the Second Amendment and what your view on it is.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think Heller was a wrong decision, in my own opinion. That's my own opinion. It's a very hot take. But I believe that if we look at the actual history of the Second Amendment in the historical context, and based off, as a history student and looking at this stuff, the reason it was created was initially for, indigenous death squads essentially to steal Native American territory and violate a number of treaties that we had created with Native Americans.
Okay, so the government made those treaties, and the government broke those treaties, and the government genocided the Native Americans. So definitely we should disarm the citizenry, because the government is so nice, right? They're racist, and they ruin people's lives, and they genocide the Indians, and so definitely the Second Amendment is for them to only have guns and not us. Hot take, silly take. Look, all that stuff is, the stuff with the Native Americans, a lot of that stuff is true, but the point was to have the populace be armed for defense of persons and of the state.
For people that were settling further and further west in direct violation of Native sovereignty. Then, after that, it went on to become part of slave patrols.
I wonder if he thinks Natives' sovereignty allows them to own guns. Or, or whatever they want. And do you think he thought maybe they needed them? Right? Like, if he was to talk to Geronimo, let's say, And Geronimo said, well, I want to be able to buy whatever gun I can. The more powerful, the better. Anything the U.S. military can have, I want to have. What do you think? Would David Hogg be okay with that? Or would David Hogg say, really, Geronimo, that's too violent. You shouldn't do that. I think he would understand that Geronimo has a legitimate reason to want that. Whatever wrong things Geronimo did, maybe he's a bad example because of all the people he murdered. But that same argument is true for people who aren't Native Americans, right? Just because you're not a Native American or a black person doesn't mean you can't be oppressed and tyrannized by the federal government, or any government for that matter, whether it be a police officer or an army division. And if you want to have options to resist them, the more options you have, the better.
Having a well-regulated militia, to help patrol people and own people and, help provide for the entire system of injustice and horror that was slavery in the United States.
Right, slaves weren't allowed to own guns. Blacks weren't allowed to own guns. So he is very much in the tradition of not even Jim Crow, but anti-black colonial enslavement here to favor the disarmament of anyone.
And after the end of slavery, that well-regulated militia, the historical context.
Discuss, and this is another one that there's a lot of interest in, obviously, is the Second Amendment and what your view on it is.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think Heller was a wrong decision, in my own opinion. That's my own opinion. It's a very hot take. But I believe that if we look at the actual history of the Second Amendment in the historical context, and based off, as a history student and looking at this stuff,
I recommend anyone who wants to see lots of quotes and research in this, look up the documentary In Search of the Second Amendment. It's about 12 years old at this point, but really, really good. And it's just full of Founding Fathers quotes and extensive looks at the text. So you can watch that for yourself and gauge the degree to which you find Hogg's characterization to be accurate or inaccurate.
The reason it was created was initially for indigenous death squads, essentially, to steal Native American territory and violate a number of treaties that we had created with Native Americans for people that were settling.
Man, the government sounds evil and genocidal. I guess we should give up all of our guns then, right?
Further and further west in direct violation of Native sovereignty. Then, after that, it went on to become part of slave patrols and having a well-regulated militia, to help patrol people and own people and, help provide for...
Right, and the people being owned were disarmed by law. Okay.
The entire system of injustice and horror that was slavery in the United States. And after the end of slavery, that well-regulated militia went on to become policing. In some ways, it went on to become the National Guard. And that's still what I see it as. I don't see it necessarily as it was reviewed in Heller as an individual right.
Right. The Bill of Rights are not individual rights. You don't have any right to free speech. That's, as long as the New York Times can write, then that's good enough. You don't personally have the right to speak. It's not an individual right. It's a collective right. Same with the Fourth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. That's not a collective right. As long as somebody out there doesn't have to incriminate themselves, then you can, because somebody out there could. So tough, right? What are the other collective rights in the Bill of Rights, Mr. Hogg of Harvard?
Necessarily. I think if we actually are talking about specifically what was meant in the original, kind of founding, I believe it's a collective right of states, to have something like a National Guard.
Well, all the points he said how bad states are, state violence, state genocide, state tyranny, it's funny that he wants them to have all the guns.
Or a policing system in the first place. I don't think it was ever talking about an individual right. And that's, I don't know if that's necessary.
Coleman asked him if he wants to ban or get rid of the Second Amendment, and he says it's not necessary.
Typically, I try to be more focused on how do we act realistically right now instead of trying to think of something that may or may not happen or even may or may not be necessary in the first place. And instead, how can we actually work together as a country to help resolve this issue in the first place? while acknowledging it is a very sensitive area that many people feel very emotionally attached to because of, and
Right, it's all emotion. There's no reason behind any of it, right? Everyone who disagrees with you is just being emotional. Got it.
a multitude of reasons in the first place. And at least right now, I don't know if it needs to be abolished. I don't necessarily think it does. But I'm trying to acknowledge that I don't necessarily know everything in the first place. I'm
That's good to be humble like that.
21 years old. I'm always learning new things. I haven't gone to law school, so I can't really necessarily talk on that specifically because in regards to that specifically, I just don't know enough about it to really feel.
No, and that's the end. So I'll put a link to the full video because it is worth watching. They go into some extent about what he's doing in college and what he's studying, which if you're a big David Hogg fan, you can watch that. It doesn't really talk about gun control, but it's interesting. It's quite interesting actually, and this is something that you're seeing now more and more on the left. And one thing that I didn't put clips in there is he's very, very, Black Lives Matter and like redlining and systemic racism, which he asserts is a real thing that's ongoing constantly. We can disagree about that, but then the logic is kind of weird that like we should then disarm people to as much as possible, reduce the number of guns as much as possible in society. And he wants to, I guess to his credit, take them away from the cops, but he's not going to take them all away from the cops. He's not going to take them from the military. And how he's going to reduce that, the only specific policy thing he came up along those lines was the 10-round magazine. Well, that doesn't reduce the number of guns by even one. What exactly, how are you going to get the numbers down? And how does that square with your clear belief and knowledge, I would say to a large extent accurate knowledge, that the state is tyrannical, the state is evil, the state has no accountability, it gets to arbitrate its own power, right? The restrictions on it that are put in the Constitution, they're a dead letter, man. They only mean what the government says that they mean, which means they're kind of meaningless. Now, given that enough part of the population does like parts of it and are willing to, try and to force the government to live up to them, there are some restrictions because of that, but not because of their own restraint. They're not physically restrained by the Constitution at all. They appoint the judges, they pay the judges, they train the judges, they accredit the judges and the prosecutors, and they create the law. So it's kind of a sham. Alexander Spooner was completely correct when he critiqued the Constitution, 150 years ago at this point. So anyway, interesting. I was actually surprised by a couple of things that he said. I was surprised by some of the things Coleman said, but I thought that there was a lot in there that was omitted that, I just don't think that David says he's not an expert. Coleman, I'm not an expert either, but I know apparently more than they do. At least it seems like based on my reading. But anyway, wanted to put that out there. Good on them for at least having the conversation. Credit to David Hogg for just being willing to do that and putting himself out there, even though I think he's wrong and could stand to learn more. But otherwise, hope you all are having a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.